journey into the life of one of history's most extraordinary figures, Joan of Arc. Born a humble peasant, she defied every expectation to lead armies, inspire a nation, and stand unwavering in her faith. Her story is one of courage, conviction, and sacrifice, set against the turbulent backdrop of the 100 Years' War. So, sit back, relax, and let's uncover the remarkable tale of the Maid of Orleans, her rise, her triumphs, and her enduring legacy. A humble beginning. Joan's early life. Joan of Arc's story begins in the quiet village of Domremy, nestled in the eastern region of France known as Lorraine. Born in 1412 to a family of modest means, Joan grew up as the youngest of 5 children in a world shaped by the turmoil of the 100 Years' War. Her parents, Jacques d'Arc and Isabelle Romay, were hard-working peasants who instilled in Joan a strong sense of faith and resilience. The village, though remote, was not untouched by the conflicts that raged across France, and the shadow of war loomed heavily over Joan's childhood. Joan's early life was marked by simplicity. She spent her days helping with household chores, tending sheep, and learning the practical skills expected of peasant girls. Despite her humble background, Joan stood out for her devout piety. From a young age, she exhibited a remarkable dedication to prayer, often retreating to the local church to seek solace and guidance. Her deep connection to her faith became a cornerstone of her character, shaping the extraordinary path she would later take. Domremy was situated near the border of Burgundian-controlled territory, and Joan's village frequently experienced the instability of the war between France and England. Raids and skirmishes were a constant threat, and the villagers lived with the fear of displacement and destruction. These hardships left a lasting impression on Joan, nurturing a deep sense of empathy for the suffering of her people and a growing determination to act on their behalf. At the age of 13, Joan experienced the first of her divine visions, which would forever alter the course of her life. She later described these visions as visitations from Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret, who conveyed a singular, urgent mission to save France and help crown Charles V as its rightful king. These messages were clear and unrelenting, filling Joan with an unshakable conviction that she had been chosen by God to lead her country to victory. For several years, Joan kept her visions a closely guarded secret, unsure of how to act on them. Her resolve grew as the political situation in France worsened. The English occupied large swathes of northern France, and the Burgundians, allied with England, controlled key territories. Charles VII, the Dauphin, struggled to assert his claim to the throne, facing challenges both from within and outside his fractured kingdom. Joan believed it was her divine duty to intervene. In 1428, at the age of 16, Joan decided to act on her visions. She approached Robert de Baudricourt, a local lord in nearby Vaucouleurs, to seek support for her mission to meet the Dauphin. Initially dismissed as a naive peasant girl, Joan's persistence and unwavering faith gradually earned her credibility. Local villagers, impressed by her determination, began to believe in her divine calling and petitioned Baudricourt to grant her an audience. Joan's conviction was remarkable for someone of her age and background. She faced significant skepticism and ridicule, as medieval society had strict expectations for women, especially those from the lower classes. Yet Joan's charisma and piety seemed to transcend these barriers. She argued that her mission was divinely ordained and that she had been chosen to deliver France from its enemies. Her determination eventually won over Baudricourt, who provided her with an escort to travel to the Dauphin's court at Chinon. By early 1429, Joan set out on her journey, disguised in men's clothing to ensure her safety, a decision that would later become a point of controversy during her trial. The road to Chinon was fraught with danger, but Joan's resolve never wavered. She saw her journey not just as a political mission, but as a spiritual one, guided by faith and a deep sense of purpose. Joan's early life and her decision to heed her visions laid the foundation for the extraordinary events that followed. A quiet peasant girl in a war-torn village, she would rise to lead armies, challenge societal norms, and inspire a nation. Her humble beginnings remind us that greatness often emerges from the most unlikely places, and her story continues to resonate as a testament to courage and faith in the face of insurmountable odds. Divine visions, a call to action. Joan of Arc's life changed forever at the age of 13, when she experienced her first divine vision. She described it as a radiant light accompanied by the voices of Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret. These figures, revered in medieval Christianity, delivered a clear and extraordinary message. Joan was chosen by God to save France from its enemies and ensure Charles VII was crowned as its rightful king. For a young peasant girl from Domremy, this calling was as improbable as it was profound. Joan, however, spoke of her visions with unwavering certainty. She described them as a source of peace and clarity, instilling in her a deep sense of purpose. At first, she kept these experiences private, confiding only in her family. Yet, as the voices grew more insistent, urging her to act, Joan realized she could not ignore what she believed to be a divine mission. The political turmoil of France during the 100 Years' War gave her visions a sense of urgency. England occupied large parts of northern France, including Paris, and their Burgundian allies controlled much of the east. The French people, demoralized by years of war and defeats, saw little hope of reclaiming their homeland. Charles VII, the Dauphin, had yet to be crowned due to rival factions and territorial losses. For Joan, this crisis was not only a political disaster, but a spiritual one. Domremy, Joan's village, lay on the border of Burgundian-controlled lands, and its residents often endured raids and violence. This proximity to conflict deeply affected Joan, fostering her empathy for the suffering of her people. By the time she was 16, Joan's visions had convinced her that God had entrusted her with the task of leading France to victory. In 1428, Joan took her first step toward fulfilling this mission. She traveled to Vaucouleurs, a nearby town loyal to Charles VII, seeking an audience with Robert de Baudricourt, the local commander. Joan boldly declared her divine calling and asked for an escort to meet the Dauphin. Unsurprisingly, Baudricourt dismissed her claims, mocking her as a naive peasant girl with delusions of grandeur. course of several months, she returned to Vaucouleurs multiple times, each time reiterating her belief that she had been chosen by God. Her determination began to attract attention, and the villagers, moved by her sincerity and piety, started to believe in her cause. Word of Joan's visions spread, and her growing support pressured Baudricourt to reconsider. By early 1429, Joan's persistence paid off. Baudricourt, perhaps impressed or simply out of curiosity, agreed to provide her with an escort to Chinon, where the Dauphin resided. Before departing, Joan chose to wear men's clothing, a decision made for practical reasons to protect her modesty on the dangerous journey. This choice, while pragmatic, would later become a key point of contention during her trial. The journey to Chinon was fraught with peril. Joan and her small entourage traveled through hostile territory, risking capture by English or Burgundian forces. Yet Joan remained resolute, convinced that God's guidance would see her safely to her destination. Upon arriving at Chinon, Joan faced another challenge: convincing Charles VII and his court of her divine mission. The Dauphin, skeptical but desperate for any hope in the war, was hesitant to believe her claims. Joan, however, demonstrated remarkable confidence and insight, even revealing information about Charles that she claimed could only have come from divine revelation. Her sincerity and determination eventually won her an audience. Joan's visions were not merely spiritual experiences. They became the foundation of her identity and her actions. They gave her the courage to challenge societal norms and inspired those around her to believe in a seemingly impossible cause. This unshakable faith would guide Joan through the triumphs and trials that lay ahead, shaping her extraordinary journey. As we move forward, we'll explore Joan's first major victory at Orleans, a defining moment that cemented her reputation as both a military leader and a symbol of hope for France. The 100 Years' War. A nation divided, Joan of Arc's story unfolds against the backdrop of the 100 Years' War, a protracted and devastating conflict between France and England that lasted from 1337 to 1453. At its core, the war was a struggle for the French crown, rooted in territorial disputes, political rivalries, and claims of legitimacy. By the time Joan emerged on the scene, the war had left France fractured, its people demoralized, and its future uncertain. The origins of the war trace back to a dynastic crisis. In 1328, the French king Charles V died without a male heir, leaving the succession in dispute. England's Edward III, the son of Charles I's sister Isabella, claimed the throne of France through his maternal lineage. However, French nobles invoked Salic law, which barred succession through the female line, and instead crowned Philip VI of the Valois dynasty. This decision ignited tensions between the two kingdoms, eventually erupting into war. In the early phases of the conflict, England achieved significant victories. Battles such as Crécy, 1346, and Poitiers, 1356, demonstrated the superiority of English longbowmen and left France in disarray. The Treaty of Bretigny in 1360 temporarily halted the war, but at great cost to France, ceding large territories to England. However, under Charles V, France regained some ground, only for the conflict to reignite with renewed intensity in the 15th century. By the time Joan was born in 1412, France was in a dire state. The crushing defeat at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415 had left the French military demoralized, and the English seized vast territories, including Normandy. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 was perhaps the greatest blow to French unity. It disinherited the Dauphin, Charles VII, and recognized Henry V of England and his heirs as the rightful rulers of France. When Henry V died in 1422, his infant son, Henry VI, inherited both crowns, creating a dual monarchy in theory, but deep divisions in practice. The Dauphin, Charles VII, retained control of a diminished and fragmented territory in central and southern France, known as the Kingdom of Bourges, for its administrative center. He was perceived as weak and ineffective, his claim to the throne undermined by the Treaty of Troyes and the Burgundian alliance with England. France was on the brink of collapse, and many believed its downfall was inevitable. Joan of Arc's village of Domremy lay on the border of Burgundian-controlled lands, and its residents frequently experienced the horrors of war. Raids and skirmishes were a part of daily life, instilling in Joan a deep sense of empathy for her people's suffering. These experiences, coupled with her strong faith, planted the seeds of her belief that she had a divine mission to save France. By the late 1420s, the political and military situation had become untenable. The English were tightening their grip on northern France, while Burgundian forces threatened from the east. The French army was weakened, and morale among the populace was at its lowest. The siege of Orléans in 1428, a strategic stronghold on the Loire River, symbolized the precariousness of the French position. If Orléans fell, the path to the south and the art of Charles VII's territory would be open to the English. It was in this desperate moment that Joan emerged. Her divine visions and her belief in her God-given mission to liberate France and crown Charles VII provided a beacon of hope. Her timing was critical. The French people needed a unifying figure, and Charles VII needed a symbolic and spiritual rallying point to restore his legitimacy. Joan's faith and determination made her that figure, setting the stage for her extraordinary journey. The 100 Years' War created the fractured, war-torn world into which Joan was born. Her emergence was not just a product of faith, but a response to the desperation of a divided nation seeking salvation. As we move forward, we'll explore how Joan took her first steps toward fulfilling her mission, beginning with her daring journey to meet Charles VII, the journey to the Dauphin. Gaining trust, Joan of Arc's emergence as a leader in France's darkest hour began with an audacious journey to meet Charles VII, the uncrowned Dauphin. Her mission was clear: to convince him that she was sent by God to save France and secure his coronation. But for a 16-year-old peasant girl with no formal education or political connections, gaining access to a royal court, let alone persuading a future king, was an extraordinary challenge. In 1428, Joan first approached Robert de Baudricourt, the captain of Vaucouleurs, a town loyal to Charles VII. She explained her divine visions and her mission to save France. Predictably, Baudricourt dismissed her, laughing off her claims and advising her to return home. Undeterred, Joan persisted, visiting him multiple times over the course of several months. Her persistence, combined with her evident sincerity and an unwavering confidence, began to attract attention. Joan's growing reputation as a young woman of divine purpose eventually won over locals in Vaucouleurs, who petitioned Baudricourt to take her seriously. Among her supporters was Jean de Metz, a soldier who was deeply impressed by her conviction. Joan's supporters convinced Baudricourt to give her an audience. Finally, in January 1429, he relented, providing her with a small escort to travel to Chinon, where Charles VII held court. The journey to Chinon was fraught with danger. The roads were perilous, patrolled by English and Burgundian forces, and the winter weather made the trip even more treacherous. To ensure her safety, Joan donned men's clothing, a practical choice that would later become a point of controversy during her trial. Despite the risks, Joan remained resolute, bolstered by her faith and the belief that her mission was divinely ordained. After traveling over 300 miles, Joan and her entourage reached Chinon in February 1429. Gaining access to the Dauphin was no simple task. The French court was filled with skeptics and opportunists, and Charles himself was deeply cautious. Surrounded by advisors who doubted Joan's claims and questioned her motives, Charles hesitated to grant her an audience. When Joan was finally brought before Charles, she faced a test. According to legend, Charles decided to disguise himself among his courtiers to see if Joan could identify him without prior knowledge. To everyone's astonishment, Joan approached him directly, addressing him as the Dauphin. This act, seen as a sign of divine insight, impressed Charles and the court. Though skepticism lingered, Joan spoke with Charles privately, telling him of her visions and her divine mission to drive the English out of France and see him crowned at Reims. She reportedly shared details about a private prayer he had made, convincing him that her words came from a higher power. While Charles remained cautious, Joan's confidence and charisma left a strong impression. Before committing to Joan's mission, Charles sought confirmation of her legitimacy. He sent her to Poitiers, where she underwent a thorough examination by clergy and theologians. Over several weeks, Joan was questioned about her visions, her motives, and her adherence to church doctrine. Remarkably, she emerged from the scrutiny unscathed. The examiners found no evidence of heresy or deceit, and declared her pious and virtuous. With this endorsement, Charles finally placed his trust in Joan. He provided her with a horse, armor, and a small force to accompany her to Orléans, where the French army was struggling to break the English siege. For the first time, a young peasant woman was entrusted with the fate of a nation, defying every expectation of what was possible in medieval society. Joan's journey to the Dauphin was a pivotal moment in her life and in French history. It demonstrated her unshakable faith, her ability to inspire others, and her determination to overcome obstacles. Against all odds, she had earned the trust of a future king, setting the stage for her first major victory at Orléans. As we continue, we'll explore how Joan rose to prominence as a military leader, rallying French forces and achieving a decisive victory that changed the course of the war. The Siege of Orléans. Joan's first victory. By early 1429, France was on the brink of collapse. The English controlled much of the north. Their Burgundian allies held key territories in the east, and the French morale was at its lowest. Orléans, a critical stronghold on the Loire River, was under siege by English forces led by the Duke of Suffolk. If Orléans fell, the path to central France and to Charles VII's remaining territory would be wide open. It was in this desperate moment that Joan of Arc arrived, bringing hope to a nation teetering on the edge of ruin. After gaining Charles VII's trust, Joan was provided with a small army and sent to Orléans to relieve the besieged city. Despite her lack of formal military training, Joan was granted an unusual amount of authority, a testament to the desperation of the French leadership and the faith they placed in her divine mission. Her arrival at the city on April 29, 1429, was a moment of both hope and skepticism. The defenders of Orléans, led by Jean de Dunois, known as the Bastard of Orléans, were wary of Joan's inexperience, but inspired by her confidence and the symbolic power she carried. Joan's presence electrified the French forces and the Essy city's inhabitants. Her unwavering belief that God had sent her to save France lifted morale and united the soldiers and citizens in a way that no general or nobleman had been able to achieve. She carried a white banner adorned with images of Christ and lilies, symbolizing purity and divine favor. This banner would become an iconic symbol of her leadership and faith. The English, who had entrenched themselves in a series of fortifications surrounding the city, dismissed Joan as a superstitious peasant girl. They mocked her claims of divine guidance, yet they could not ignore the growing momentum she brought to the French cause. Joan wasted no time in urging the French commanders to take the offensive, rejecting their cautious strategies and advocating for bold, decisive action. The turning point came on May 4th, 1429, when Joan led the French forces in an attack on the English-held fortress of Saint-Lô. The assault was a resounding success, and the fortress fell, boosting the morale of the French troops. Over the next few days, Joan continued to spearhead aggressive assaults on the remaining English fortifications. Her leadership style was characterized by fearlessness and a deep connection to her soldiers, whom she inspired with her courage and conviction. The most dramatic moment of the siege occurred on May 7th, during the assault on Les Tourelles, the heavily fortified bridge tower that controlled access to the Loire River. The battle was fierce and bloody, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. During the fight, Joan was struck by an arrow which pierced her shoulder. Despite the injury, she refused to retreat. Bandaged on the battlefield, she returned to rally the troops, urging them to continue the assault. Her presence galvanized the French forces, who launched a final, determined push. By the end of the day, Les Tourelles had fallen, breaking the English grip on Orléans. The siege was lifted, and the English retreated in disarray. The victory at Orléans was a turning point in the 100 Years' War, and marked the first major French success in years. For Joan, the victory was a vindication of her divine mission. It silenced many of her skeptics and solidified her reputation as the Maid of Orléans, The French people, who had long been demoralized by defeat after defeat, now saw her as a symbol of hope and divine favor. The victory not only saved Orléans, but also paved the way for Charles VII's coronation at Reims, a critical step in restoring his legitimacy as king. The psychological impact of Joan's leadership was perhaps even greater than the military victory itself. Her faith and determination inspired soldiers and civilians alike, uniting a divided nation and challenging the perception of women's roles in medieval society. She proved that courage and conviction could overcome even the most daunting odds. As we continue, we'll follow Joan's journey to Reims, where she fulfilled the next phase of her divine mission, securing the coronation of Charles VII and solidifying her place in history. The coronation of Charles VII, Joan's triumph. The victory at Orléans in May 1429 marked a turning point in the 100 Years' War and solidified Joan of Arc's status as a symbol of hope for France. However, Joan's mission was far from complete. Her divine visions had been clear. Charles VII must be crowned king in the city of Reims, the traditional site for French coronations. This act would not only affirm his legitimacy, but also rally the fractured kingdom under his rule. His path to Reims was fraught with challenges. Much of the territory between Charles's court in Chinon and Reims was controlled by English and Burgundian forces, making the journey perilous. Charles's advisors, ever cautious, debated whether to proceed, but Joan, emboldened by the victory at Orléans and her unwavering faith, urged immediate action. She argued that securing the coronation would not only fulfill God's will, but also inspire the French people to continue the fight against their oppressors. Joan's conviction proved persuasive. Charles VII, who had begun to trust in her divine mission, agreed to the plan. In June 1429, the French army began its march toward Reims. Along the way, Joan's presence inspired towns and fortresses to surrender without a fight. Places such as Troyes and Chalons, which might have resisted under normal circumstances, opened their gates to the advancing forces, moved by the symbolic power of Joan's leadership and the momentum she had generated. On July 16, 1429, Charles VII and his army entered Reims without encountering any resistance. The cathedral, the historic site where French kings had been anointed for centuries, stood ready to host the ceremony that would change the course of the war. For Joan, this moment was deeply symbolic. Her journey, which had begun in the remote village of Domremy, had brought her to the very heart of French political and spiritual life. The coronation ceremony, held on July 17th, was a grand and solemn affair. Charles VII was anointed with holy oil, a tradition dating back to the time of Charlemagne, and crowned in the presence of clergy, nobles, and soldiers. Joan stood by his side throughout the ceremony, her banner in hand, a visible reminder of her role in making the event possible. Witnesses described the moment as profoundly emotional, with many seeing Joan as a divine instrument sent to restore France's fortunes. After the coronation, Joan reportedly knelt before Charles and addressed him as King of France. Her mission, as she understood it, was now complete. The coronation represented the culmination of her divine mandate and a vindication of her belief in the power of faith to overcome impossible odds. The impact of the coronation was far-reaching. It legitimized Charles VII's claim to the throne, undermining the English-backed claim of Henry VI and reinvigorating French morale. For the French people, it was a unifying event, affirming their identity and their determination to resist foreign domination. Politically, it shifted the balance of power in the war, rallying support for Charles and weakening the resolve of his enemies. Despite the triumph, tensions began to emerge between Joan and Charles's court. With his coronation secured, Charles grew more cautious, favoring diplomacy over continued military action. Joan, however, was determined to press the advantage, urging a campaign to reclaim Paris and liberate all of France. Her uncompromising commitment to her mission clashed with the political pragmatism of the king and his advisors. The coronation at Reims marked the high point of Joan's influence and her symbolic power. It was the moment when she fully realized her divine mission, transforming her from a humble peasant girl into a national heroine and a figure of enduring legend. Yet it also signaled the beginning of her gradual marginalization within the French court, as political priorities began to shift away from the bold, faith-driven strategies that had defined her rise. As we continue, we'll explore the final chapter of Joan's story, her capture, trial, and execution, which would solidify her legacy as both a martyr and a saint. The fall, capture, and betrayal. Joan of Arc's triumph at Reims and her central role in the coronation of Charles VII marked the pinnacle of her journey. However, the political landscape of France remained deeply fractured, and her mission to liberate the nation was far from over. Determined to drive the English and Burgundians out of French territory, Joan pressed for continued military action. Yet, as her unwavering faith pushed her forward, the realities of war and politics began to work against her. After the coronation, Joan urged Charles VII to capitalize on the momentum and launch a campaign to reclaim Paris, still under Anglo-Burgundian control. Initially, Charles approved her plan, and the French army marched toward the city. However, the assault on Paris in September 1429 proved disastrous. Joan was wounded in the leg during the attack, and the French forces failed to breach the city's defenses. Charles, who had begun favoring negotiations over warfare, called off the campaign. Joan's failure to take Paris marked a turning point in her relationship with the king and his court. While she remained a beloved figure among the French people and soldiers, her influence within the royal circle began to wane. Charles, now crowned and recognized as king, shifted his priorities toward consolidating his rule through diplomacy, rather than relying on Joan's bold military strategies. Joan's uncompromising nature and insistence on continuing the fight increasingly alienated her from the cautious and politically minded advisors surrounding the king. In early 1430, Joan resumed her efforts to liberate northern France, leading a series of small-scale campaigns. She traveled to the town of Compiègne, which was under threat from Burgundian forces. On May 23, 1430, Joan led a sortie against the Burgundians in an attempt to defend the city. The battle quickly turned against her, and As the French forces retreated, Joan found herself surrounded by enemy soldiers. She was pulled from her horse and captured. Joan's capture was a devastating blow to the French cause. For the Burgundians, she was a valuable prize, and they wasted no time in selling her to their English allies for a substantial ransom. The English viewed Joan as a dangerous symbol of French resistance, and her capture presented an opportunity to discredit her and demoralize the French. Imprisoned in Rouen, Joan was handed over to an ecclesiastical court for trial. The English, determined to destroy her reputation, accused her of heresy, witchcraft, and cross-dressing, charges designed to undermine her divine claims and paint her as a threat to both church and society. Her trial, which began in January 1431, was heavily biased, with English officials exerting significant influence over the proceedings. The conditions of Joan's imprisonment were harsh. She was held in a secular prison rather than an ecclesiastical one, guarded by male soldiers and subjected to constant surveillance. Despite these challenges, Joan maintained her composure and steadfastly defended her actions. She consistently reaffirmed that her mission was guided by God and refused to renounce her visions or her belief in their divine origin. The trial itself was riddled with irregularities. Joan faced relentless questioning by theologians and clerics, many of whom sought to trap her into contradicting herself. One of the key accusations was her decision to wear men's clothing, which she explained was both practical for battle and necessary to protect her modesty in prison. Despite her logical explanations, her accusers used this as evidence of her supposed heresy. On May 29, 1431, after months of interrogation and psychological pressure, Joan was found guilty of heresy. The next day, she was led to the marketplace in Rouen, where she was burned at the stake. She was only 19 years old. Witnesses described her final moments as deeply moving. Joan reportedly called out to Jesus and the saints, her faith unshaken even as she faced death. Her execution sent shockwaves across France and Europe. While the English believed her death would demoralize the French and weaken their resistance, the opposite occurred. Joan's martyrdom galvanized the French people, strengthening their resolve to fight. Over the next 2 decades, the tide of the war turned in favor of France, and by 1423 the English had been expelled from nearly all French territories. Joan's story did not end with her death. In 1456, Charles VII ordered a posthumous retrial to clear her name. The court declared her innocent and denounced her original trial as corrupt and politically motivated. This rehabilitation restored her honor and cemented her legacy as a martyr and a symbol of French unity. Joan's capture and betrayal reveal the complex interplay of faith, politics, and power in medieval Europe. The trial. Faith under fire. Joan of Arc's trial stands as one of the most infamous episodes of her story, revealing the political and religious complexities of the time. Captured by the Burgundians in May 1430 and sold to the English, Joan was imprisoned in Rouen, the heart of English-controlled France. Her trial was orchestrated not to seek justice, but to destroy her reputation and discredit the divine claims that had inspired the French resistance. The trial began in January 1431 and was overseen by Bishop Pierre Cochon, a staunch ally of the English. Cochon's primary objective was to secure a conviction that would undermine Joan's legitimacy as a divinely guided leader and demoralize the French people. The charges brought against Joan were numerous and varied, ranging from heresy and sorcery to the wearing of men's clothing. Each accusation was crafted to portray her as a threat to both the church and the social order. Joan faced relentless questioning from a panel of theologians and clerics, many of whom were heavily influenced by English interests. Over the course of several weeks, she endured intense interrogations, often conducted without legal counsel or the opportunity to prepare her defense. Despite these challenges, Joan demonstrated remarkable poise and intelligence. Her responses, while simple and direct, often revealed a profound understanding of theology and a deep conviction in her divine mission. One of the most contentious charges against Joan was her claim that her voices and visions were messages from God. The court sought to portray these experiences as either delusions or demonic in origin. Joan, however, steadfastly defended the authenticity of her visions, insisting that they had guided her to act in accordance with God's will. Her unwavering faith and refusal to recant these claims frustrated her accusers, who struggled to find inconsistencies in her testimony. Another point of contention was Joan's decision to wear men's clothing. Her choice, which had been practical for her role as a military leader, was framed by the court as an act of defiance against the church's teachings on gender. Joan explained that she had worn men's clothing for protection, particularly during her imprisonment, where she feared assault from her male guards. Despite her logical reasoning, the court seized on this issue as evidence of her alleged heresy. The trial was riddled with procedural irregularities. Joan was denied the right to appeal to the Pope, a violation of canon law, and her access to clergy who might support her was strictly limited. Witnesses who could have testified in her favor were not called, and the proceedings were conducted in a manner designed to ensure her conviction. Despite the court's bias, Joan's strength and clarity shone through. When asked whether she believed she was in God's grace, a potentially incriminating question, she famously replied, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God keep me there." This response, both humble and profound, silenced her interrogators and underscored her unwavering faith. After months of questioning, the court found Joan guilty of heresy. On May 29, 1431, she was sentenced to death. The next day, she was led to the marketplace in Rouen, where she was burned at the stake. Joan faced her execution with remarkable courage, reportedly calling out the name of Jesus as the flames consumed her. Witnesses described the scene as deeply moving, with even some of her enemies expressing regret at her fate. Joan's trial and execution were intended to erase her influence and tarnish her legacy. However, they had the opposite effect. Her death galvanized the French resistance, strengthening their resolve to fight against English domination. Over time, Joan's story grew into a powerful symbol of faith and patriotism, inspiring generations. In 1456, a posthumous retrial ordered by Charles VII overturned her conviction. The court declared her innocent, recognizing the original trial as deeply flawed and politically motivated. This rehabilitation not only restored Joan's honor, but also cemented her place as a martyr and a hero. Joan's trial reveals much about the intersection of faith, power, and politics in medieval Europe. Her steadfastness in the face of relentless persecution remains a testament to her courage and conviction. As we move forward, we'll explore how her legacy evolved after her death, culminating in her canonization as a saint and her enduring influence on history. Martyrdom. Joan's execution on the morning of May 30th, 1431. Joan of Arc was led from her prison cell in Rouen to the marketplace where her execution awaited. She was just 19 years old, convicted of heresy by a court deeply influenced by English interests. Joan faced the ultimate punishment, death by burning at the stake. Yet, even in her final moments, she demonstrated the unshakable faith and courage that had defined her life. The execution site was packed with onlookers, soldiers, clergy, and townspeople, all drawn by the spectacle. For the English, Joan's death was meant to be a public demonstration of their power and a warning to those who might resist them. For many in the crowd, however, it was an act of profound injustice. Joan's trial and conviction had been riddled with irregularities, and her unwavering testimony had left a deep impression on both her supporters and her enemies. Joan was dressed in a plain white shift, her usual armor and even her male clothing taken from her. Her hands were bound, and she was escorted to the pyre by guards. Before being tied to the stake, she asked for a crucifix. An English soldier, moved by her bravery, fashioned a crude cross out of wood and handed it to her. She held it tightly as she was secured to the stake. A more formal crucifix was also brought to her by a sympathetic clergyman who held it up so Joan could see it as the flames began to rise. Her final words, according to witnesses, were prayers to Jesus and the saints. She repeatedly called out, "Jesus, Jesus," a testament to her faith even in the face of unbearable suffering. As the flames consumed her, many in the crowd were overcome with emotion. Some wept openly, and even among the English soldiers, there were murmurs of regret. One chronicler recorded that an English officer reportedly said, "We are lost. We have burned a saint." Her ashes were gathered and scattered in the Seine River to prevent any relics from being collected, but her memory could not be extinguished. Joan's death had the opposite effect of what her enemies intended. Rather than silencing her influence, it elevated her to the status of a martyr. The French people, already inspired by her victories and her unwavering faith, now saw her as a symbol of resistance and divine justice. Her execution became a rallying point, strengthening the resolve of those fighting for France's liberation over the next 2 decades. The tide of the 100 Years' War shifted in favor of the French. Charles VII, whose throne Joan had helped secure, eventually ordered a posthumous retrial in 1456 to clear her name. This process, known as the rehabilitation trial, thoroughly examined the original trial's proceedings and found them to be corrupt and politically motivated. The court declared Joan innocent of all charges, restoring her reputation and officially recognizing her as a martyr. Joan's death also set the stage for her transformation into a symbol. In the centuries that followed, her story was retold in countless forms: chronicles, plays, paintings, and later films. Her life became a source of inspiration for movements of national pride, religious devotion, and even feminist ideals. In 1920, nearly 500 years after her death, Joan of Arc was canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church. Pope Benedict XV recognized her extraordinary faith, her unwavering commitment to her mission, and her ultimate sacrifice. Today, she is venerated as the patron saint of France and a symbol of courage in the face of adversity. Joan's martyrdom remains one of history's most compelling stories, a testament to the power of belief and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Her willingness to stand by her convictions, even at the cost of her life, has ensured that her legacy endures as a beacon of hope and inspiration. Next, we'll explore the enduring impact of Joan's story, how she became a saint, a national icon, and a figure of universal admiration.